In our second series of How to Fix Democracy, we're focusing on the relationship between economics, particularly capitalism, and contemporary democracy. The real question, though, is what has become of economics in the age of Trump, in the age of Bolsonaro and Modi and many of the other authoritarian populists that are redefining democratic politics in 2020. Mark Blyth is a professor of economics, a very distinguished professor of economics at Brown University. He's a world authority on the history and the idea of austerity. And he's also the author or co-author of a really interesting new book about something he calls angry-nomics. Mark, has economics in 2020 degenerated into angry-nomics?
Unfortunately, it has. And we see this right across the world. In fact, it's been building for a long time. And one of the main arguments that we make in the book is that don't think that Trump is a cause. Trump is a symptom, as is Bolsonaro, as is Modi, of a series of economic changes over the past 30 years, which have systematically created a series of inequalities and fragilities, which were covered up in the 2008 crisis by huge amounts of central bank liquidity. But ultimately, that just acts as a kind of sticking plaster. The sticking plaster is coming undone, and the result is the various populisms that we see across the world.
But isn't economics always a form of angry-nomics? There are always going to be losers. There are always going to be people who think they deserve more money, more wealth. They're always going to resent the people who are more successful. Or is there something about post-2008 economics that lends itself particularly to anger and resentment?
Absolutely. A very simple way to think about this is why do we focus on anger? We focus on anger because anger, as our work in this book uncovers, basically falls into two types. There's kind of tribal energy and norm regulation, which is what you see with Trump and right-wing populism, weaponizing popular resentments. And the other one's claims to moral outrage. Now, an interesting example is the following. When Iceland went bang in the beginning of the financial crisis, when its banks were 1,000% of GDP and they couldn't be rescued, the public got angry, but they weren't furious, and they basically kept their welfare institutions intact. And by the time we got to 2013, they were recovering. What really drove them mad was around 2016, when they found out in the Panama Papers that the elites that had been in charge both before and after had been stashing their money offshore. There's this idea that there's one law for everyone who's normal, and then there's one law for the people who have been running things. And there's a kind of two sets of accounts. There's the obvious accounts and the obvious stories they tell about the economy. And then there's the actual things that have been going on. Now, one doesn't need to jump down conspiracy theories on this, but the lack of trust that there is in technocratic institutions, particularly in the wake of a financial crisis that saw most of the costs being put on the people who were not the people who were rescued, that has certainly bred a bunch of, let's say, fragilities into these political economies, which politicians can weaponize.
Mark, what's the history of angry-nomics? You're an expert on the history of austerity. Some people might suggest that angry-nomics was born perhaps in the late 1920s and 30s. Or what's the difference between contemporary angry-nomics and the kind of resentment that bore fascism, European fascism in the 30s?
So the old Greek saying about you can never go in the same river twice, I think that applies. Simply because we went to the 1930s and did all that awfulness means that we can't actually do the same thing now. So the comparisons are always a bit forced. But I put it this way, or rather we put it this way in the book. Two things generate angry-nomics. The first one are large financial crises. Whenever there are large financial crises, it tends to mobilize the political right, and it tends to put the costs on non-asset holders. There's a kind of asymmetry in the way the costs get shared. So that's a commonality, and we saw that in the 30s, and we saw that again in the most recent financial crisis. But what we also saw in the 1930s was this rise of civil society through social institutions, which now no longer exist. Trade unions on one side, fascist clubs on the other, the church. All of these social institutions have declined in importance. We're a much more atomized society. At the same time, what's different now is technology in the way that it interacts with labor markets, our jobs, our general feelings of security or insecurity, as we have more and more people on short-term contracts, precarious work, low wages that seem to be structurally determined. And on the other side of that, we have these societies which are getting older. So all of the OECD countries are getting older. And that has important consequences for who has assets over the lifetime, for asset concentration across the distribution, which tends to be with old people. They're the ones who tend to vote more than young people. So we end up in a world which is very much where we are now, where they tend to carry huge amounts of debt and have no assets, and a minority of the old have all of the assets. So all of that's very different from the 1930s, and it leads to an anger, but a very different type of anger.
Mark, you grew up in Dundee, one of the early towns of the Industrial Revolution in Scotland, and as you joke, I know, one of the first places to actually deindustrialize. There was strong class consciousness in places like Dundee. People from the working class were united. Why aren't the precariat, why aren't Uber drivers or other members of the precariat, why don't they have class consciousness? Why don't we have precariat style political parties as we had working class labor parties in the 20th century?
It's a great question. So let's go back to that moment in the 1930s. These were social organizations that emerged out of a union movement that had a mass basis. You had 40 to 50% of populations enrolled in unions. You had industries that were predominantly nationally focused. They were not able to move their capital abroad, thereby giving labour a voice in terms of using the strike as a weapon. On top of that was layered the whole series of social institutions, socialist workers' clubs, churches, etc., as I mentioned before, all of which have kind of fragmented. Add on top of that the fact that we have much more diverse societies now, much more multicultural societies, and the ability of class basically to speak for itself is always cross-cut with these other tensions and with these other claims towards identity and attention. And let's not forget that for the past 30 years, we have actively waged a campaign against people unionizing, whether it's been in the soft version of the OECD's 1984 jobs report, which gave us the whole notion of flexible labour markets, which was a soft way of saying get rid of labour market protections, or in the much harder route that's been taken either by capital and its ability to move abroad and thereby do wage suppression and rewrite contracts with domestic workers, or in terms of governments, for example, in the way that Mrs. Thatcher faced down and broke the British trade union movement. So there's been multiple forces at work which have meant it's much more difficult to do that now. The fact that we actually have any type of unionization at all at the current moment speaks to the valiant work that's done at that level by organizers, but it's an uphill battle.
Mark, theorists of democracy from Tocqueville onwards through Arendt have always argued that the core of democracy lies in the very intermediary organizations that you're talking about. With this fragmentation of the workforce, this fragmentation of society, this disappearance of the church and trade unions and other institutions in terms of organizing people's political activity and very identity, what's the impact on democracy? Does this inevitably undermine democracy? Is it, as Hannah Arendt warned, this fragmentation results in the seeds of totalitarianism?
Not necessarily. In fact, probably not. My other favourite line from Arendt is the point of politics is to argue about ends, not means. So let me start there. It's not as if the centre parties that have been running things for the past 25 years have acquitted themselves well. They built a business model that said finance can grow as big as it's like, so long as we can tax and transfer, we don't care. We built inequalities and fragilities into the system. We passed off governance towards technocrats, whether they're in central banks or in international institutions. And we started to treat our citizens less as our fellow citizens, more as social problems to be nudged into better behaviours, to be managed as populations rather than some active component of your citizenry. Capital was global, politics was local, but the disjunction between the two of them was allowed to fester. And that's part of the problem that we're in. So one way to think about this is, what is the default container for desires and hopes, given that democracy is inherently national? It becomes the nation. And that tends to be weaponized in a very right-wing way, which we see with Bolsonaro and Trump and Modi, but it doesn't have to be. There are other examples basically of taking the nation and the notion of the nation, positive citizenry, in a much more progressive direction. And we see this, for example, Martin Wolf in the Financial Times a couple of days ago wrote this a very amazing essay about the importance of citizenship and the notion of reconstituting the citizen as the core of any democratic capitalist settlement. And I think that he's exactly right. That's where we need to begin. And that's about taking nationalism seriously, but not on the terms of the reactionary right.
Let's come back to that idea of citizenship, of reinventing citizenship in the 21st century. Perhaps talk about citizen assemblies, which is one form of of innovation, which is being experimented with in Europe. But I want to come back to your critique of the contemporary age. We haven't mentioned the C word yet, Mark, capitalism. Is that the problem or the solution? Is the problem that citizenship has been boiled down or confused with being a consumer, and that we're treating all our individuals not as citizens but as consumers in a vast capitalist globalized system?
I think there's some merit to that critique, but I also think it's overdone. At the end of the day, what does capitalism do? What does any economic system try and do? It basically tries to extract more value than it puts in, efficiency. And if you manage to do that and create growth and rising living standards, that's good. It's a growth machine. Now, there are many problems and critiques with growth in the contemporary moment, but setting that aside just for a moment, if you don't have a system that grows and your population is growing, you're in trouble. And the growth that we've had over the past 100 years, particularly in the period from 1940 to 1970, has been absolutely spectacular. Right? We're wealthier now as a planet than we've ever been. At the same time, we've never been more divided and more angry. So the key question then becomes, what do you do with a capitalist system that generates astonishing inequalities? As Piketty put it, R is always greater than G. The rate of return on assets is greater than the growth in the economy. In the neoliberal period, growth has fallen. It's become harder to come by. At the same time, financialization has meant greater profits for smaller and smaller number of firms and individuals. So to me, it's about how you regulate. What are the guardrails that you put around capitalism? What are the rules that you put in place to make sure that that incredible growth potential actually benefits the majority of citizens? And if you do that, particularly if you can give them stakes in that system, real stakes, not pretend stakes, then you actually have an amazing growth machine. So it is certainly a cause of problems, but in the right hands, it's also a solution. I don't see what the alternatives are.
Is the problem, though, anger? Because there's, in some ways, as much anger on the left. And as you know, there's a huge debate now about the intolerance on the left. Clearly, the right is deeply skeptical, if not hostile, to democracy. Does being angry, and is angry-nomics the foundation of intolerance, of an inability to accept the legitimacy of other people's arguments, of wanting to shut people up, of shutting down the very democratic foundations?
I think it's more of a symptom rather than a cause. And here's what I mean by that. What the right did as a genius political move 30 years ago was to take their values and turn them into transitive objects in the world. They made them into things. And either you accepted the existence of the thing and the thing was good, or you were basically outside of their discursive community. You were wrong. That's it. The left for a long time argued with these things called facts, but they found out you can list all the facts you want. It doesn't emote. It doesn't hit people with affect. I think the combination of the failure of a kind of like fact-based liberalism, the technocratic liberalism to do what it says on the tin, combined with the growth of the internet and the ability of the internet to polarize and create homophilous communities where people only need to talk to each other who are that share their own preferences, has allowed the left to fall into the same trap of confusing what they take to be their values as being absolute truths that other people must conform to. This is not a universal trend, but it's certainly there, and it is definitely not good news for democracy. However, let's remember that what democracy is at the end of the day is allowing the person who you don't like to rule so that you can win the argument the next time round. I think that we can fetishize the whole notion of freedom of speech and all this sort of stuff as being the cure-all for this. If you look at the United States, freedom of speech was exactly the argument that was used to put up Confederate monuments in the 1930s. Freedom of speech is what allowed the KKK to be the KKK. So let's not equate democracy with this rather narrow conception of freedom of speech a la the United States. I think that there's much more going on than that.
Do we find angry-nomics in Northern Europe, in Germany, in Denmark, in Scandinavia, in the Netherlands? Or is angry-nomics a particular feature of Anglo-American liberal capitalism or neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it?
It's actually common everywhere. If we think about, the more equalitarian states in Scandinavia. So you had the Sweden Democrats. What did they manage to do? They managed to put immigration on the agenda. But there's this notion that Sweden is this small, correct, but very homogenous society, which is very incorrect. It had a huge influx of immigrants from the Balkan Wars and from other civil conflicts through the 1980s and 1990s. And it's a very different country in that regard. The Swedish elite, along with the Danes, did exactly the same thing, basically had a kind of rule that said anyone who wants to talk about immigration is a racist. So it became verboten. You were not allowed to talk about it, which is exactly what you do if you want to create the conditions for a right-wing party. The people who figured this out were the Danish Social Democrats, who basically said, all right, we need to talk about this. We'll be honest about it. It has problematic features. We need to get rid of this idea that we can't talk about it. And they did. They won the election, and what did they do? They basically took the problem seriously, developed better integration and education policies, and then moved ahead. So those forces are there. Again, it's like in most things in life, it's how you treat it. Germany has the AfD. They seem to be on the back foot now, particularly because of Merkel's competence in comparison over COVID, vis-a-vis the Anglo-American models. But if you want to see angry-nomics, just go to Italy. Just look at the way the Italians are so frustrated over the EU budget and how this whole notion of a rescue fund begins at 750 billion, becomes a Corona bond, gets whittled down into grants and loans, and is now going to be vetoed by the Dutch. If 2 years from now, when we get out of COVID, God willing, and the EU turns around and says, right, time to turn up the fiscal screws again, a healthy dose of austerity. Italy already hadn't grown for 20 years. It's now heading towards 30 years of actually not having a positive growth model.
You've pointed out, so many people, others in the series, that we have a dysfunctional politics. You seem to be suggesting that solution is political. But that, of course, is a contradiction. Rebecca Henderson, a professor of economics at Harvard, who I'm sure you know, came on the show recently to argue that the beginnings of this reform aren't going to come from government. They need to come from business, because business is perhaps more accountable, and that these firms can achieve more than government. Where does the beginnings of fighting angrynomics start, Mark? Can it happen from within corporations, or do we really need to rely on the state?
Ultimately, I don't buy the argument about corporations at all. There was a study out of Copenhagen last year that said 45% of what passes for FDI flows around the globe is tax dodging. The whole notion of ESG, laudable though it is essentially buy as much Tesla as you can so that you look good to your investors. You're not getting out of oil because you really want the green transition. You're getting out because you're worried about stranded assets. Firms have a specific purpose, make money. The side effect is jobs and growth. So I wouldn't look to them to do anything other than guard their bottom line. Besides which, so few of them are at scale. It's like saying business has to take care of climate change. How is that going to happen? How would an average firm deal with climate change? It's just a non-starter. We have states for a reason. They tax and spend 30 or 40 or 50% of GDP for a reason. What we're facing is a problem of massive public goods provision, and we need to reorient states into new areas, those areas that would help to build wealth for their citizens rather than just tax them, and would also give them forms of representation and stakeholdership, which they currently lack. So I'm with the state.
Your book, Angrynomics, is very explicit there, and you and your fellow author, Eric Lonergan, argue that we need new political ideas and perhaps parties. Where are they going to come from, Mark?
So in terms of political ideas, we think they follow from doing different things with your economy as it stands. I mean, take the United States. The United States basically has a Republican Party which is beholden to this leader that it didn't really expect, and to its corporate patrons and what they want. You have a Democratic Party, it's split. It has half of that exactly the same, basically being beholden to corporate patrons. And then an activist wing, which is grounded in different communities around the United States. So how do you gel all that into something new? What's the space for something new coming out of that in these duopolies? It's very limited. Well, it's very limited until you change the business model that they're allowed to operate under. So one of the things that we argue in the book, or to use an analogy that's not in the book that we started using, we think about what we should do is move the furniture around. So imagine you're in a room. You have a whole bunch of people who are a little bit pissed off with each other. If you set the chairs up so that they're back to back, you're not going to get any resolutions. If you bring in some beanbags, couches, mood lighting, perhaps some gin and tonics, you never know what happens. Move the furniture around. So what's the political economy equivalent of furniture? Well, that's what we have in the back of the book. One of the ideas that we're very fond of is that of a citizens' wealth fund. So a very quick version of this, a bit like what Norway has got, but like Singapore has got. But the way you fund it is anytime that there's a financial crisis or other crisis, investors dump equities and buy bonds as safe assets. It means the government's cost of capital is inverse to the private sector, which is why every A-rated sovereign can now issue a 15-year bond at a negative real rate. That means investors are paying you to borrow from them. So you take the money, you buy all the equities that they've dumped, you don't get the central bank to do it and then hand it back to them once everything's okay again, and you put it in a professionally managed passive fund, and then you make the owners of that the citizens of the state. You then allow compound interest at 6% to work its magic over those equities, and over 10 years you could generate 20% of GDP. That would make an enormous dent in inequality. That's a huge amount of money for decarbonisation investments, job training, whatever you want to spend it on. It's a part of the furniture. Once you have that in your economy, it changes the possibility set of what you can talk about. And there's lots of things that we could do with existing ideas, repurposed and a few new ideas. The real problem is the lack of political courage to actually try these things. That's the issue, not the ideas.
How central is democracy in your fix to the problems of early 21st century globalization and inequality?
It has to be absolutely central, because if there's no real feeling of stakeholdership, if you don't feel that you're a citizen of this place, if you're not invested in it, if your state doesn't take any responsibility for your well-being, as really is the case in the United States just now, then you have every right to be angry.
Isn't the issue, and again, it's chicken and egg with Angrynomics, but isn't the issue getting the population to accept the credibility of elites? Because it's only through elites that we're going to build things like sovereign wealth funds.
I think that's right, but not all credibility has been destroyed, but a lot of it has been damaged. And it's been damaged because we overclaimed. Go back to before the financial crisis. Banks are the best judges of risk. The central banking community absolutely knows what it's doing. All you need is interest rates to control everything. Look, everything's fine. And then when it all went down, did we apportion blame or blame line? No, we bailed out the people that caused the problem. So you're quite right, you're going to damage your credibility if you behave in that way. If it turns out that you're hiding your money abroad, and we found out in the Panama Papers, and you've been telling us we're all in it together, of course your credibility is going to be damaged. But that doesn't mean that the basic institutions of capitalist democracy are afraid. Even the United States, the Supreme Court today turned around and said, no, I'm sorry, Mr. Trump, they can look at your tax records, right? So we do have institutions which still have credibility. People do still care about elections. Not all political parties have collapsed like the Italian party system or the French party system. Some of them are still quite robust. So there's a lot to build on. But the way we need to do that is by looking forward, not like we do in the United States all the time, where the progressive side basically looks back 90 years to whatever Roosevelt did and said, let's do that again. That's almost 100 years ago. Can we not look to the future?
Or even back to Johnson, back to the 1960s. Is it a generational issue, though, Mark?
Yes.
Has our generation essentially failed? Old white men, maybe you're slightly younger than me, but we're still relatively old. Is now the ball in the court of younger people who need to rebuild and rethink everything?
Well, let's think about it this way. So pretty much all capitalist economies, even the ones that redistribute, when you look at wealth, have a kind of 80-20 split. 80% is held by 20% of the population. But really, within that 20%, there's another 80-20 split, and that's the people who really own everything. And they're all old. And what we've progressively done is enrich ourselves over our life cycle, our generation, and the boomer generation. I'm a Gen Xer. Am I a Gen Xer? I'm the one before boomers, whatever it is. I think I'm a Gen Xer. But anyway, the boomer generation have basically soaked it all up, written the laws for themselves, awarded themselves tax cut after tax cut, etc., and now got their investments bailed out twice, 2008 and now with COVID. Meanwhile, we've got a younger generation who understand climate change as an existential threat to them because they would like to live in tolerity. We have younger people who realize that what they're spending on an education relative to the income that's generated from it simply isn't worth it in many cases. And they're increasingly surrounded, drowning in debt and have no corresponding assets because they're all held by the old. This is what Piketty talks about in his book as the new patrimonial capitalism. You have this small percentage of people who have most of the assets. They'll pass on huge amounts of money and perpetuating intergenerational inequality on a massive scale. That's exactly the world that they're facing. So again, when I think of the Extinction Rebellion, and I think about what they're arguing for, when I hear their voices, I see anguish, but I also see an intense moral outrage that they know that they're going to be handed the biggest bill of all time, but they know that basically their grandparents have still got the cash to pay for it.
Finally, Mark, I'm not sure whether you've cheered me up or made me more miserable simultaneously. I think you've done both. Where do we begin?
It's
one concrete thing. You're an economist or an angry-nomist. You understand the world. You're not just living in utopian theories. Where do we begin? One thing that's doable over the next 2 or 3 years.
Build a sovereign wealth fund. Build a citizens' wealth fund, because there will be more economic crises. Your cost of capital is negative. You could issue 20% of GDP of every country, build it, buy the equities, redistribute over 10 years and make a huge dent in inequality. You could also stop giving away the profit fuel to the most profitable firms in the world that pay no taxes. The Facebooks, the Googles, the Apples. We should have national data trusts, and we should sell them the data and then get a data dividend that we can then use for investment. And one more thing, for God's sake, really stop talking about green bonds of issues of about 10 billion as being a celebratory event. We need massive decarbonization. It needs to be depoliticized, not Green New Deals, decarbonization, so that everyone can get behind it. And if that means doing deals with people who have been bad, like oil companies, to get us there, then unfortunately that's the moral price to be paid.